Every economic era has a line it swears it will never cross. A boundary, a limit, a point where borrowing becomes danger instead of strategy. But in 2025, the world isn't just approaching its credit limit. It's pretending the limit doesn't exist. Nearly every nation on Earth, from wealthy superpowers to tiny island states, now relies on debt not as a temporary tool but as the oxygen of survival. With global debt soaring past $315 trillion, almost 3 times the size of the world economy. The most disturbing part is not the number itself, but the reality that the system now requires more debt simply to stay alive. This is the financial historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks, because behind every speech about managing debt, behind every promise of stability and sustainable borrowing, lies a truth almost no one dares to say out loud. There is no plan to repay any of this, not in 2025, not in 2035, not ever. The modern global economy only functions if debts never disappear, they only roll forward endlessly. And to understand how we arrived at a world that borrows more every 90 days than entire nations produce in a year, we must travel back centuries to a time of muskets, wooden ships, and kings with empty treasuries, long before spreadsheets and digital ledgers. Nations discovered that borrowing gives you more power than having money. A lesson England learned in 1694 when, nearly bankrupt and low on gold, it struck a revolutionary deal with merchants that would lend the crown money in exchange for a permanent stream of interest backed by future taxes. A simple agreement that created the Bank of England and changed human history from my history by allowing governments to spend money they did not yet have. France copied the idea, Holland refined it, and the United States built its entire foundation on it because debt was not a burden, it was a superpower, and that belief became the architecture of the modern world, where governments, banks, corporations, and citizens all live inside a system made entirely of promises. Fast forward 300 years, and every war, recession, boom, rescue, and expansion has been financed with borrowed money. But in the 20th century, borrowing shifted from necessity to strategy, becoming a policy, a lever, and a design. And once central banks joined the loop, printing money to buy government IOUs, the machine became unstoppable. Governments issued debt, investors buy it, central banks absorb it, new money enters the system, and the cycle repeats until every dollar, euro, and yen is mirrored by an IOU somewhere else. Because debt-free money no longer exists, currency is backed solely by confidence in future repayment that never comes. So the system grows and grows like a shark that must keep moving or die, and by late 2025 the scale has become unreal. $38 trillion owed by the US, $14 trillion by Europe, $9 trillion by Japan, and more than $315 trillion worldwide, increasing by nearly $1 trillion every 100 days. But the danger isn't the size, it's the behavior. Countries refinance monthly or weekly, turning rollover into an industrial routine that depends entirely on trust. Because if investors doubt a nation's ability to roll over its debt, if confidence cracks even slightly, the entire cycle can snap. Interest rates spike, currencies fall, governments weaken, banks tighten lending, economies freeze, and streets erupt in protest. We've seen smaller versions in Greece, Argentina, Sri Lanka, Turkey, Lebanon, Zambia, Ghana, and Pakistan, but those were local fires. The question now is what happens when instability hits the strong nations, the core of the global system? What happens when the world itself reaches its limit? Because debt has grown so massive, so constant, so circular that it no longer resembles a financial tool but a global operating system, one that must never freeze, never crash, never reboot. And yet every system has constraints, every architecture has flaws, every model has a breaking point. So the real question, hidden beneath all the trillion-dollar headlines, is simple and terrifying. What happens when the world reaches the edge of its borrowing capacity? Not a recession, not a crisis, but the moment the machine cannot take on more promises and cannot survive without them. When the world approaches its credit limit, the cracks never appear loudly at first. They show up quietly, in the places only insiders pay attention to. Bond auctions that used to sell out in seconds suddenly take minutes. Interest rates that were stable for years begin to twitch. Central banks start using unfamiliar language, temporary liquidity measures, market functioning operations, structural adjustments, phrases that sound harmless but historically only appear when something deeper is wrong. In private meetings, sovereign wealth funds whisper that US treasuries feel different. Banks begin shortening loan durations from 10 years to 5, from 5 to 3, and from 3 to 1. Pension funds shift from long-term bonds to overnight facilities, a move ordinary people never notice but one that signals fear at the highest levels. This is how confidence dies, not in a crash, but in a slow, frightened retreat. And once confidence weakens, the debt-based world starts behaving like a pressure chamber. Countries with weaker currencies, Turkey, Egypt, Nigeria, and Pakistan, find refinancing suddenly more expensive. Nations that once borrowed at 3% now pay 8, 10, or even 15%. Investors flee into the dollar, not because they trust America completely, but because they trust everything else less. This triggers a self-feeding storm. The strong get stronger, the weak get squeezed, and global inequality widens at hyperspeed. At the same time, central banks scramble, pumping trillions into markets to keep yields from spiraling. But every injection creates another problem: higher inflation, weaker currencies, rising tensions between governments and their citizens, who wonder why groceries double while wages stay frozen. The world begins splitting into two groups: nations that can print the currency they owe and nations that cannot. The first group survives through dilution. The second group faces collapse. And in the background, a new threat begins to form, something far more dangerous than inflation or recession. It's what economists fear most: a synchronized global rollover failure. A moment when multiple countries, multiple markets, and multiple institutions all struggle to refinance at the same time. History shows this has never happened on a global scale, but the numbers in 2025 suggest we are closer than ever. The IMF quietly increases its emergency credit lines. China accelerates lending across Asia and Africa to secure political loyalty. The US Treasury holds unprecedented closed-door meetings with major banks. Behind every public reassurance lies private panic, because if one major nation stumbles idly, Japan, France, or the UK, the shock would ripple outward instantly, raising borrowing costs for everyone, triggering capital flight, draining reserves, freezing credit markets, and turning a fragile system into a falling structure. And yet, the true danger isn't the collapse itself. It's what comes after. When governments lose access to cheap borrowing, they lose the ability to fund pensions, healthcare, defense, energy subsidies, and basic stability. Citizens become divided between those who demand austerity and those who refuse it. Populism surges, political systems fracture, and suddenly, debt isn't an economic issue anymore. It becomes a national security threat. This is the moment when elites begin moving their money offshore, buying farmland, accumulating gold, and shifting into private credit markets, because they know that once the world hits its credit ceiling, the first impact is financial, but the second impact is social, and the third impact is geopolitical. The balance of power between nations shifts, alliances strain, currencies weaken, and investors begin asking the question no politician ever wants to answer: if the debt machine stops expanding, who absorbs the losses? And that question leads directly into the final stage of this story, the moment when countries must decide between default, inflation, austerity, or a complete restructuring of the global financial order. For 2 centuries, the debt lived like a ghost, paid, unclaimed, quietly poisoning every generation that inherited it, until the world realized too late that the ledger didn't just record money, it recorded humiliation. By the mid-1900s, rival nations weren't arguing about coins or signatures anymore. They were fighting over pride, over centuries-old wounds that fathers passed to sons like cursed heirlooms. Leaders stood before their people and told them the same story: they owe us, they wronged us, they must pay. And every time change felt possible, someone reopened the old book of accounts and pointed to the same line written in fading ink, the same unforgiven debt that had already caused 3 wars, millions of deaths, and entire cities reduced to ash. But here's the part no one talks about: the debt technically could have been erased at any moment. A single handshake, a single signed document, or a single moment of humility could have ended the cycle forever. But pride is the most expensive currency in history, and no one was willing to give it up. So instead, governments printed new money, forged new alliances, made louder threats, and armed themselves with deadlier weapons, all to prove they were not the ones who would bend first. Even when the world changed, when borders shifted, when kings were replaced by presidents, and when generals were replaced by cabinets, the debt remained like a stain no one could wash away. And as new generations grew up, they didn't question the number or the story behind it. They only heard that our ancestors suffered, so you must stand ready to fight. That's how a 200-year-old unpaid debt continued fueling conflicts, long after its original purpose died, long after the gold it referred to had lost its value. It became something bigger, a myth, a weapon, a justification for every new battle. And here's the most haunting truth today, right now, locked in archives and diplomatic files. That same debt still exists. The amount is symbolic now, tiny compared to modern economies, but its political weight is enormous. All it would take is one ambitious leader, one speech, and one demand to finally settle the debt of our ancestors, and the world could spiral back into the same rivalry that once set continents on fire. Because when a debt becomes part of national identity, it never really disappears. It waits, it lingers, and history, as it always does, waits for the perfect moment to repeat. itself.